Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Pfeiffer. I'm the social sciences editor at Choice and the editor of LTI. On behalf of Choice, LibTech Insights, and Toward Inclusive Excellence, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Data and Indigenous Studies, Entry Points for Academic Libraries. Today's session is a joint presentation from LibTech Insights, a library technology content vertical from Choice, and Toward Inclusive Excellence, Choice's content strand that explores issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in and outside of the higher education community. My colleague Fatima and I will talk briefly about each in just a minute. However, before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so you don't have to worry about generating noise or feedback. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the shared screen or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you would like to see addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button at the bottom panel of the screen. You can also turn on the automated translation for the captions by clicking on the arrow button, toggling to translation, and selecting your preferred language. Please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording as well as the slides. All right, before we jump into the presentation, I would like to tell you a little bit about LTI. So, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, all of which are written by and for librarians. We talk a lot about AI literacy and tools, accessible user design, and so much more. You can find out more about LTI and read the blog via the links in the chat. We also send out one email a week with our latest post and some hand-picked tech stories, usually in the realm of AI, so I'd highly recommend signing up. It takes just a few seconds. Now I'd like to hand it over to Fatima, the editor of Toward Inclusive Excellence, who'll talk about TIE and introduce our speakers for today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fatima Mohi Eldon. I'm the editor of TIE, or Toward Inclusive Excellence, which is a content strand from Choice that explores issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in and outside of the higher education community. We publish weekly blog posts, interviews, resource lists, and more. And if you would like to receive updates about our new content, please use the links in the chat to sign up for our newsletter and to read the TIE blog. So with that, I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today. Starting with Kaya McLeod, who's a member of the James Smith Cree Nation and is the University of Calgary's Indigenous cataloging librarian, as well as Rachel Chong, who is a Métis citizen through her maternal grandfather, originally from St. Boniface, Manitoba. She currently works at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Surrey, British Columbia, as the Indigenous Engagement and Subject Liaison Librarian. And finally, Bronte Chang, the Digital Literacy Librarian at the University of Calgary. So with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker for today, who is Kaya.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So today, I'm going to be talking about cataloging metadata, Rachel's going to be talking about Indigenous-focused roles, and Bronte is going to be talking about non-Indigenous-focused roles. Let's get into this. So a little bit more about me. I'm of dual heritage. I'm a member of the James Smith Cree Nation and also Clan MacLeod, Scotland, obviously last name like MacLeod. I was born and raised in Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory. I have lived and worked in Calgary, which is Treaty 7 territory for the last 4.5 years. I got my MLIS and my Bachelor of Arts, both from the University of Alberta. And I come from a library family. My sister's a librarian, my dad's a librarian. Just really good love of librarians here. I've been in my tenure track position for 4.5 years. Knock on wood, hopefully all goes good. And I would like to take a moment to do our land acknowledgement for I am here in Calgary. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation within Alberta, including the Nose Hill Métis District 5 and Elbow Métis District 6. And also just want to take a moment to be reflective in land acknowledgement and consider the fact that I live in a place that has easy, accessible, clean water that I can just get from the tap. That is very nice, and I really enjoy that. Now, let's get on to the stuff you want to hear me talk about. So, I'm going to be talking about Fair Care OCAP, TK labels and mark records. I have a little mock-up to show you. And then, of course, metadata a hat. I'm going to switch over and talk about some subject headings. When I was in library school, I can very well remember being taught about FAIR, where we want data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But we also want to take into consideration care, which, according to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, we need to take into consideration collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And I find this pairs really well with OCAP, the First Nation principles, which has to do with ownership of data, control, access, and possession. And you might be wondering how this all ties back to metadata, and that is through the creation of local context, traditional knowledge, or TK labels and notices. From the article, The Care Principles and the Reuse, Sharing, and Curation of Indigenous Data in Canadian Archaeology, the authors talk about the digital tags or markers such as notices and traditional knowledge and biocultural labels can be supportive implementation of the care principles in a machine readable environment for digital heritage, as well as biological and genetic sequence information. Institutions can implement notices, example, placeholders while a community develops its labels, and this can facilitate the use of TK and BC labels as permanent component to Indigenous sources. These efforts build relationships based on respect and trust with Indigenous communities. So, in case you were unaware of what TK labels or traditional knowledge labels are, the local context defines them as an initiative for Indigenous communities and local organizations, developed through sustained partnership and testing within Indigenous communities across multiple countries. The labels allow communities to express local and specific conditions for sharing and engaging with future research and relationships in ways that are consistent with already existing community rules, governance protocols for using, sharing, and circulating knowledge and data. This means that TK labels are designed to be community driven. A community needs to be the driving force for using these labels, not the institution. So I picked a couple examples from their website, which I do have a link to here. The first one is an example of a provenance label, TK family, and their generic label that you can edit says this label is being used to indicate that this material is traditionally and usually not publicly available. The label is correcting a misunderstanding about the circulation options of this material and letting any users know that this material has specific conditions for sharing between family members. Next, we have the protocol example of TK Women Restricted. And the blurb says this material has specific gender restrictions on access. It is regarded as important, secret, and/or ceremonial material and has community-based laws in relation to who can access it. Given its nature, it can only be accessed and used by authorized and/or initiated women in the community. If you are an external third-party user and you have access to this material, you are requested to not download, copy, or remix and circulate this material to others. And lastly, we have this example of a permission label, TK Open to Collaborate. This label is being used to make clear, insert community name, is open to future engagement, collaboration, and partnership with research opportunities, because we all know that nobody likes to get 50 million emails from different researchers about the same question. Sometimes it's easier to have a label that says it all. Now, I also mentioned notices. So remember, TK labels, community-driven notices, institutions and researchers can put these on. The website defines them as tools for institutions and researchers to identify Indigenous collections, data, and recognize Indigenous rights and interests. The notices were developed to create pathways for partnership, collaboration, and support of Indigenous cultural authority. So this can be a way to take a step for institutions and researchers who are looking to do something, and they can be put into MARC records, as we will see. The first image is an example of an engagement notice. It's basically open to collaborate. Our institution is committed to developing a new modes of collaboration, engagement, and partnership with Indigenous people for the care and stewardship of past and future heritage collections. The next is a disclosure label. Attribution incomplete. Collections and items in our institution have incomplete, inaccurate, or missing attribution. We are using this notice to clearly identify this material so it can be updated or corrected by the community of origin. And lastly, collections care notice, a leave undisturbed. The leave undisturbed notice, as you would assume, is being used to indicate that items in a collection should not be disturbed. They should only be moved or disturbed under very limited circumstances according to community guidance. So I have an example. They have tons of examples on their website. I would really recommend checking it out. And this is how it can visually look with the TK labels and their little explanations: BC provenance, BC research use, BC open to collaboration. So you don't have to ask, how would this look? You can see it right now. I also have a couple links, so when you guys get the PowerPoint presentation, you can take a look at them. For here's how it looks in the Library of Congress, here's how it looks. They love putting examples on their website, and I, as a cataloging librarian, really appreciate that. I'm a visual learner. But I asked our digital collections if they could make a little mock-up for me to use in this presentation, because at the moment we don't have anything in our collection that has actual TK labels on it. But as I mentioned, visual learner, I'm expecting some of you attendees are also visual. So this is what it could look like with the little traditional knowledge at the very bottom. And because we're all nerds here, this is what the back end of our Orange Dam system looks like, where we've already put it in. You can decide to put in these specific traditional knowledge labels on an item as soon as we are asked to do it. The idea is really being ready to take that step forward. Again, we as the institution can't really do anything until the community asks us to do anything. So we're just ready and willing to do it once they do ask. Now, going to have a little bit of a whiplash here because I'm going to change and talk about subject headings. Again, cataloging librarian, we have to talk about metadata, and that's data about data. So it is very important to use the correct terminology when labeling things, as you can expect. And this actually means having to use different vocabularies. Now, because I assume not everybody here is a metadata librarian, you might not know, I'm going to give you a little rundown of what all of these acronyms are. So LCSH is the Library of Congress subject headings, and it's used throughout the world of records. It's the biggest standard international vocabulary that we have access to. However, that does mean a big ship will take a while to turn. Although they have been working on updating their subject headings related to Indigenous peoples, it is going to take some time before anything official is released. Next, we have Canadian subject headings, CSH. This is a supplementary vocabulary to LCSH, so that means if the term already exists in Library of Congress, Canadian subject headings is not going to make a term unless they are wildly different. Then we have Finmio, the First Nation Métis Inuit Indigenous Ontology, sometimes referred to as the Ontology. This focuses exclusively on Canadian Indigenous groups and lists things like community name, cultural affiliation, band number, reserve number, as well as vetting information. So who vetted it, what source did they use, what day was it? And this is really important because language is always changing and evolving, and things do change. Like within the past couple years, the Calgary land acknowledgement has changed because one of the groups has updated their name. They used to be the Westleigh First Nation, now they're the Goodstoney First Nation. And so we want to make sure if we have anything that we're using appropriate subject headings wise, we're using the current contemporary name because that makes it easier for people to find stuff. And then we have the CRKN, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network. And they've been updating their Indigenous subject headings for quite a while. And it's all about the metadata used in their databases. Now, to give you a little snapshot of what we're looking at, I've made this nice little chart. So we can just see the wide range of things that are going on. So Library of Congress, we have Ojibwa Indians, but in Canadian subject headings, we have Ojibwe. But then in the ontology, we have it really dependent on nation name because there is the Chapleau Ojibwe First Nation, WE, ending, and then there is the Kisikuyen Ojibwe First Nation with WAY as the ending. So it really does depend. And then CRKN equally says Ojibwe WE. Now, I am Cree, so of course we're going to talk about Cree subject headings. LCSH says Cree Indians. Canadian says Cree. Finmeo says Cree. Then CRKN says Nehiwa, which is the Cree word for Cree person. Now, I'm, of course, in Treaty 7, we're going to talk about the Blackfoot, the Siksika, and their language. We have Siksika language under Library of Congress. Canadian subject headings, we have Siksika, but it has an accent. Under Finmeo, it's Blackfoot. So really, I just want to show you that we are all trying to work on updating headings. We all have little disagreements about the spelling of things. And sometimes you got to take these things into consideration because the context does matter. And also remember that I'm only talking about English. We haven't even gotten into the idea of Canadian. We have a whole bunch of French subject headings, and those are also being updated. The world of subject headings is consistently changing, a slow-moving boulder that is going places. Hopefully, this makes you think a little. But I'm going to let Rachel talk about her stuff now.
Thanks, Kaya. So Tansei Kiawao, Rachel Dishner Carson, Mia Michif Doshin, St. Boniface. In Michif, I just introduced myself. Michif is the language of the Métis people, and I said, well, one of the dialects I was speaking. And I just said, hi, my name is Rachel. I'm from St. Boniface. And I'm grateful to Joshua Morin from Michif Cultural Connections, also based in Alberta, for teaching me Michif, the language of my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather comes from Red River, which is in Manitoba, but I was born and raised on Coast Salish territory in what's colonially referred to as British Columbia. And I currently work at Kwantlen Polytechnic University as the Indigenous Initiatives or Indigenous Engagement and Subject Liaison. And at Kwantlen Polytechnic, we serve a broad region south of the Fraser, which overlaps with the traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Kitsi, the Semiahmoo, the Tawasin, the Kakite, the Coquitlam, and the Kwantlen First Nation, which gifted its name to our university. And as an Indigenous person in Canada who lives on lands that she is not Indigenous to, and working in an institution where the name Kwantlen we carry from one of the local First Nations, I feel a great responsibility to make sure that I'm educated and working in community and collaboration with what we would call host First Nations, the First Nations whose territories we live on. So that's something that I keep top of mind as I engage in my work. And I hope it'll become apparent as I talk about some of the projects that I've been working on. A little bit about my educational background before I jump into my projects is I have a Bachelor of Arts from Simon Fraser University, located in Burnaby, and I got my MLIS at the University of British Columbia, where I received a First Nations curriculum concentration specifically. I was over a dozen years ago now, so man, I hope the curriculum's been updated a little bit. But yeah, it was a great introduction to contemporary Indigenous work and histories more broadly within Canada and globally. All right. So one of the projects I wanted to share with you today is called the Indigenous Information Literacy. It's a press book or an open education resource. This was one of the first projects I started when working at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, mostly to support the coursework that was happening on campus. A lot of instructors in Canada, we have this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And following the commission, a lot of instructors were quite inspired to try to indigenize their course curriculum material, but they weren't really sure where to start. And a lot of them were encouraging students to go and find Indigenous voices at the library. And that was a very tricky thing to do. And then some of them weren't necessarily requiring Indigenous voices, but they were just wanting Indigenous topics to be embedded in their curriculum. But students didn't really have a lot of guidance on how to find quality sources in this area. So this book was to sort of guide that process. And one of the things I start off with in the press book is really flagging that there's a lot of problematic material about Indigenous people in the library. Historically, research institutions would go to communities, they would collect their data, and then they would leave. They didn't often take into account, Indigenous protocol, which is why we now have these traditional knowledge labels being overlaid on top of these resources. And honestly, most material published prior to 1990 is often not taking into consideration these protocols, and they're often being breached. So we want to think about how we can be more respectful when engaging with the problematic material in our collection, and being careful not to reproduce harms that have historically been carried out through the academy. So that's these are not my original ideas. These are articulated by Gregory Younging. I highly recommend you read his book, Elements of Indigenous Style, but this was a piece I really wanted to highlight. So, if you have all these problematic materials in the library and we don't necessarily have relationships with Indigenous communities to apply the traditional knowledge labels, how can we engage with these resources in a respectful way? So I think this kind of comes back to a Western concept of Indigenous intellectual property, right? Those concepts of intellectual property are kind of extractive from the Western perspective, where the Indigenous communities get displaced from their property rights there. So thinking about how we can sort of return or, apply a best practice here. But with that in mind, when we're talking about Indigenous intellectual property, I want to make a little bit of a distinction here, because in a Western context, property is kind of equivalent to ownership. And that's sort of the legal framework we work within. But within Indigenous communities, we want to think a little bit bigger in terms of, if you have been gifted knowledge, you have various responsibilities. You are the steward of that knowledge. It is your responsibility to be the caretaker of that knowledge, to pass it on to future generations in a good way, and you are accountable to that knowledge. And so when we think about how Indigenous knowledge is being shared, and how Indigenous intellectual property rights are being assigned, we need to think about it in this more holistic sense regarding stewardship, caretaking, and accountability. And because Indigenous intellectual property is really tied to this concept of stewardship and a person's personal responsibility for knowledge, when we engage in sharing of information, our credibility comes from our relationship to that knowledge. And so when you look at Indigenous science or Indigenous credibility in the academy, it's really important that we distance ourselves from this concept of Western bias removal and sort of, the isolation that happens in a lot of scientific research where the researcher is removed from the equation. In Indigenous science and Indigenous information and knowledge custodianship, it's really vital that we acknowledge who we are, where we come from, what our responsibilities are, and we acknowledge our bias and our limitations as well. So this is what kind of helps us establish trust within our community and within our circle of influence. So with that in mind, there's a few things that you can consider when you're engaging with material in a library that's related to Indigenous topics. I mean, the first thing you can do is investigate whether the researcher is Indigenous and what their community ties are. But I've also seen non-Indigenous researchers engage in these situating pieces, is what we often refer to them as, situating or locating the self. And that is, within the course of the research, the researcher will talk about their family history, so who they are, where they come from. They'll talk about their nations or nationality. So in my case, I talked about my family being from Red River on my maternal side, nations being Métis, as well as mixed settler ancestry. And then you talk a little bit about your personal journey and how, what drew you to the work. What were your connections there? And then also any influential teachers that might have helped you on your way, whether that's formal academic credentials or perhaps personal connections. So while I have the formal credentials of the First Nations curriculum concentration through UBC, I'd say a lot of my knowledge about local Indigenous practices come from Elder Caton, who I'm going to be speaking about more in this presentation, but Elder Caton from Kwantlen First Nation has guided a lot of my learning journey as well. So this situating piece is really important in helping reinsert bias, but also accountability, credibility, and who you belong to as part of the research process. And it can easily be found in research papers that are sort of embracing this Indigenous notion of accountability. So with that in mind, once you've sort of sorted out the researcher's connection to the research, you also want to see if the research process is being done in a good way, in a respectful way. And some of these are pieces I've sort of pulled out myself, but you'll see in the next slide that they are reflected in like broader overarching Canadian research policy practice. So one of the things that's really important is when research is being conducted and you're assessing this is whether or not community and elders from the communities involved were being consulted during the question formation, during the research process. There needs to be an ongoing dialogue happening there. Another component to take into consideration is whether there is gifts of reciprocity. So historically, researchers would go into a community and sort of extract the research and then leave. We would be looking for something more reciprocal in research done in a good way where perhaps there's financial compensation for the community, perhaps the research information is given back to the community. So something a little bit more reciprocal in nature. We also want to make sure that Indigenous protocols are being followed throughout the process. So whether that's, consulting or maybe it's something more elaborate, such as being involved in ceremony or something like that. We want to make sure that those protocols are being followed, and also with the distribution of the information, applying things like traditional knowledge labels if appropriate. That would be a great place to acknowledge Indigenous protocol as well. And lastly, not always necessary, but important to keep as a possibility is the ability to change your perspective. So I find in some Indigenous research that I read, they actually talk about the process of shifting their research question in response to the consultation and the reciprocity and the protocol that they get involved in throughout the process. So I think that I don't see that as prominently in traditional Western scholarship, but I see it a lot in Indigenous research. So those four sort of principles, if you will, are echoed through what we call the Tri-City Council Policy Statement on Ethics, which is a Canadian framework for guiding research with human subjects, specifically Chapter 9, which focuses on engaging with Indigenous peoples. And this chapter was created specifically because of harms done by researchers in the past. It's recently, as of 2022, had a revision, but essentially the articles kind of reiterate those same points that we just discussed. So community engagement throughout the review and approval of the research kind of reiterates consulting with community and elders. The mutual benefits within research, talking about the necessity of having reciprocity embedded, knowledge being used for the community and not just the researcher, again, looking at the reciprocity element there. Looking at respecting community customs and practices, which is following Indigenous protocol, sharing the results with the community, that's reciprocity, and looking at intellectual property and attribution, again, that would be part of following Indigenous protocol. So I think if one wants to, they can go quite granularly through the TCPS2 recommendations and all the articles, but kind of keeping those four principles in mind, I think that would really help guide the research process and help you assess whether researchers have been engaging in research in a good way. So those were just some highlights from the Indigenous Information Literacy Open Education resource that I worked on. And there's a link in the reference list to the full book. But now I'm just going to shift gears to another project and hopefully another way of engaging with information, which is Orality. So print is one mode of engaging with information, but when I first came to Kwantlen Polytechnic University, I was looking at creating an Indigenous-focused library space. And repeatedly, what I heard from elders, and this is going back to research being done in a good way, you consult with community, you listen to elders. And I said, what should we be doing with an Indigenous library space here at Kwantlen Polytechnic? And Fern Gabriel from Kwantlen First Nations, she's like, well, this space should be called oral storytelling in our language, which is translates to Hohoyam in the language of Kwantlen. And so I was like, okay, oral storytelling. So there should be an oral component that we need to embed in our library practice here. And then I consulted with Lee Markle, who was faculty here at the time from Stolo. And she also really emphasized that if we didn't include orality in our library spaces, then it wasn't an Indigenous library space. And so when I was working here, I was thinking about how we could creatively start embedding orality into our collections. And that's what sparked this Indigenous Oral Stories series project. Which sounds like it should be pretty easy given the technology today. You meet with someone, you do a recording, and you post it up. Which is what is available. And if you go to our resource link, you can see all the recordings that we have been working on for the series. These series are started with Elder LeCayton, who I said he has taught me quite a lot, and I mean this immensely. Elder LeCayton from Kwantlen First Nation has such a rich and deep history of the lands here. And so we've just captured a little bit of that through these videos, focusing on the campuses that we're situated on. But before I could even engage in collecting these stories, I needed to make sure that we were honoring Indigenous protocol. And so that led me down a rabbit hole about photo release forms and permissions and intellectual property. Oh, it jumped too fast there. So what happens when we look at that? Basically, I was looking for a form to start working on these films with Elder LeCayton. And the ownership default was either if you were a capital R researcher, it went to the researcher. And if you were just an employee within the institution doing recordings, then the default permission was going to go to our institution. And I was like, well, no, the intellectual property belongs to the elder, to the Indigenous communities that are sharing this knowledge. So how can we modify these forms to make that happen? And I was really fortunate to be connected with a law firm that understood what we were trying to work with here and helped us rewrite these forms to basically reinforce these OCAP principles, so the ownership, control, access, and possession, where First Nations, well, let's just go through each point here. Ownership is where refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. This principle states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her personal information. So when I was talking to the lawyers, I was like, yes, we do need a clause for individual ownership, but we also need this collective ownership piece embedded into our form design. When we're looking at control, it's within their rights to seek control over all aspects of the research and information management process that impacts them. And so there's a lot of different clauses which allow, in this case, Elder LeCayton to decide how the research can be shared and used. In terms of access, the First Nations have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held, which is why the recordings are publicly available so that the Indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island can access those resources, but specifically the people from Kwantlen First Nation have access to those recordings. And then possession or stewardship is more concrete. It refers to the physical control of the data. Possession is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected so that those ownership rights belong with either LeCayton, his family, his community, and that the access to those pieces of information are retained. Might be a little bit dry, but I think it's really important and really, really pivotal that we have the correct foundation before jumping into projects like this. The project also supports, UNDRIP is a little bit more broad, so I don't know where you're all located, but I wanted to include the UNDRIP connections in case this supports you in creating these sorts of documents within your own institution. Specifically, these sorts of documents support UNDRIP Article 19 and Article 31, noting that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize and transmit to future generations, their histories, languages, oral traditions, but also that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage and knowledge. Goes on. And then they have the right to maintain, control, and protect and develop their intellectual property. And so regarding the forms, it was the intellectual property piece that I wanted to ensure Indigenous peoples, the people I was working with and recording, that they had that intellectual property over their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. So all that is to say, it is a little tiny project, which, technologically speaking, it should be quite simple. Legally, though, it was quite a bit of a exercise to get these forms developed and to find the right avenues to get them there. So I hope if this inspires you to look into projects like this, that you don't hesitate to get in touch, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about the process. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bronte.
Yes, thank you for coming today. I am Bronte Cheng. I'm the digital literacy librarian here at the University of Calgary. I'm joining today from Treaty 7 territory, where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. It's my favorite place. Was one of my favorite places to go in Calgary with my family. So I always love to mention that specific spot in Calgary. A little bit about me is I grew up in the US and I did my bachelor's at the University of Montana. I have dual citizenship. I moved to Canada in 2018. Like Rachel, I completed the First Nations curriculum concentration on Indigenous knowledge keeping and librarianship at UBC through my MLIS. And as I was doing that, and then afterwards, I continued to work at UBC in two different Indigenous-focused places. Wihwa Library, which is an Indigenous branch of an academic institution. So the only thing that they keep there is Indigenous knowledges, and it's a really great place to go, and it's an amazing library. And then I also worked with CTLT's Indigenous initiatives with some amazing teachers, Amy Perot and Janie Liu. My teacher at Wihwa Library was Carlene Delaye-Lyle, and those three really influenced all of the stuff that I do now. Since December 2021, I've been the digital literacy librarian here, and my portfolio is split pretty much into two areas: Indigenous librarianship support, and then technological stewardship instruction, and specifically on artificial intelligence. And I'm very much an instruction-focused librarian. I teach a lot. My AUL, Leanne Moore, has been very supportive of this work throughout many iterations, and I know that might not be the case in all places. So hopefully whatever Rachel, Kai, and I have shared today, you can take one of those breadcrumbs and continue and pull that into your own work. So again, I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm not Indigenous. My work intersects with Indigenous studies and digital ethics, but I'm approaching this as a non-Indigenous librarian, and I commit to learning and supporting, not speaking for Indigenous communities, because I don't have Indigenous experiences. I don't have that lived Indigenous experience. So I humbly say I've become a very good listener. I learn a lot from books. I read a lot of fiction books and memoirs from Indigenous people. I listen to a lot of webinars and stories shared by Indigenous voices as a way to continue and further my own learning. Within the intersections of my portfolio, one thing that I'm often asked, and you might also be asked sometimes, is how do I do Indigenous AI? And that's not something I can answer, sorry. Not only because I'm not Indigenous, but there's no single Indigenous perspective on technology, and Indigenous communities are diverse and their approaches to AI vary widely. My role as a non-Indigenous librarian in these spaces is to draw on Indigenous scholarship and collaborate with Indigenous colleagues rather than claim any sort of authority. One of the ways that I think that this is really a really great way to do is through the works by Indigenous authors like Sherry Dimelin and others like her, and Indigenous scholars like Jason Edwards Lewis. And that through those ways and through those stories, we can explore how the digital world and AI intersects with Indigenous experiences and the ongoing history of settler colonialism. So with that framing, we're going to move into how these ideas connect to instruction and research support. So whether it's teaching AI tools or general information literacy sessions, it can be very easy to treat data as abstract numbers, but something that I always teach students is that data is never neutral. It comes from people's lives, their history, and their experiences and their stories. AI systems inherit the biases of their creators and data sets, often erasing those lived experiences. And something that we do quite often in scholarship is try to remove our own lived experiences to make things as impartial as possible. And so as educators, naming our own positionality helps students see that the knowledge is situated. So I ask students to ask who benefits from the default, who's benefiting in this article, who isn't benefiting, whose voices are missing. And by centering the human experiences behind stories and behind information, I think that's the way that we move towards ethical relational approaches to instruction. And I also emphasize a bit of responsibility here that I often discuss the need to confront colonial logics that shape technologies that we use and advocate to find a way that do research that prioritize sovereignty and self-determination, even if that's the harder way to do your research, which is always something that students go, okay, I know that's the right way to do it, so I guess I'll do it. Rachel talked a bit about bias and removing bias from the process, and I also really make this a clear point in my instruction, that importance of situating yourself and being aware of your biases coming out rather than eliminating them. Because ultimately, as I just mentioned this before, but I'm trying to leave breadcrumbs for a student to pick up and follow, whether that's something about bias or critical AI thinking or critical thinking skills in general. I'm trying to get students to ask, why do I ask questions the way I ask questions, which is something that Amy Perot, one of my former teachers, taught me. That question, who taught me to do that this way? Why do I do my work the way that I do it? And having an understanding of why I'm doing things the way I do it. So if we help students by seeing data as human stories, how do we extend that beyond the classroom? Because probably like a lot of you as well. Did I go too far? Yes. A lot of you as well is also supporting faculty and students in research projects. In consultations, I emphasize that, again, data represents people, not just numbers. I'm often sharing guides that center Indigenous voices, like UBC's Libraries resource guides, and other resources that are created by Indigenous librarians or Indigenous focused librarians, Indigenous studies focused librarians. They're really great resources to look through. And I often ask students and faculty, how do your research impact communities? What responsibility comes with using this data? How are you going to steward this data with care? I also get asked often how to do community consultation with Indigenous people. And at our university, I direct them to our Indigenous research support team. And while I connect them with online resources already created by Indigenous scholars and scholarships that demonstrate how different protocols can ensure relationships and not shortcuts guide the research. And this also then can affect the way, it can also shape the way we teach technologies like AI, which is what I've been doing now the last 6 or 7, 8 months. A lot of it. Indigenous perspectives remind us that data isn't just metrics, that it's deeply tied to both people and land. And Kaya and Rachel have both talked about today, Indigenous data sovereignty is supported by UNDRIP legislations, and at other levels of government, there's different rules and laws to try to resist digital colonialism by requiring consent in government. And I say that it tries to do that because I do think that it is trying to do that, and tech companies and everything else just aren't keeping up. And so in that sort of same way that things aren't just balancing out together, when I'm teaching AI, I'm trying to constantly balance the technical skills with critical awareness, because I really don't want to shame students for using AI, because just like we live and work in colonial institutions like universities, we're also starting to have AI embedded in our daily life, whether we want to or not. And I view it like a student coming to ask me how to use any other tool. I want them to use it responsibly and ethically and critically. So to understand why this matters, we need to look at the system behind AI. And this next piece is really only about a 5-minute teach piece in my lessons. So I also sometimes have people ask, well, we only have 50 minutes. How am I supposed to fit everything in? And I think it's about fitting in the important parts. There's my arrow. So surveillance capitalism, which is a term that Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff explains, it turns private human experiences into behavioral data for profit. And this idea and this term helps students understand how we as humans with stories and lives and that are full of information have become data for people to use, and then how we've become profits for companies. And this mirrors that colonial dispossession, the extracting resources without consent or misunderstood consent, where I bet you all have also all scrolled down to the end of a page or accepted terms and conditions without reading them and not understanding what we're giving away, or having that trade-off, like, yes, I want this, so I will trade this off. At UBC, David Gardner has done some really cool and interesting work in this area and coined the term machina nullis, highlighting how big tech claims data as if it belongs to no one, which echoes that idea of the colonial idea of terra nullis, or no man's land, as a way to dispossess Indigenous people from their land when European powers came to colonize hundreds of years ago. But data is never empty, just like the land was never empty. It's tied to people and communities and people's lives. So teaching students these parallels help them see AI as part of an ongoing system of extraction, but that it also can be used for their good. And there's also and while these challenges are real, there's inspiring examples of Indigenous-led tech projects. So Indigenous Futures, which is a kind of a term coined by Jason Edward Lewis, they showcase technology that can serve community priorities when guided by sovereignty and reciprocity and relationships. So these are the two that I really wanted to highlight for you today. The Cherokee Nation Task Force report on AI and data sovereignty, where it's within the community they decided, how are we going to use this? How are we going to protect our own data? How are people in our community going to use this for good and in a good way? And then Hoosick Nation, which is in BC, uses it for ecological stewardship for counting salmon. And these initiatives share a common thread that Indigenous voices lead and community input shapes every stage. My last talking point is something that not is necessarily data, but it might be a question that you have, and I wanted to preemptively answer them, is that something I get asked all the time is when discussing these concepts is, how can non-Indigenous colleagues support Indigenous librarianship and Indigenous librarians and Indigenous knowledge-keeping practices? And so I want to be clear, I don't speak for Indigenous communities, but what I've shared here comes from what Indigenous colleagues and teachers have told me over the years and what I've learned through listening, which is first sharing the labor, joining Indigenous-like communities and taking on administrative roles so the burden doesn't fall entirely on Indigenous colleagues. For example, I chair at our university for our library, our Indigenous Strategies Working Group. And much of the work of the chair is project management and admin, which are tasks that doesn't need to be done by an Indigenous person. It's just very time-consuming work to do all the calendaring and organizing in the emails. So second, committing to self-directed learning, reading Indigenous authors, attending storytelling webinars, and taking training. I found that humility means showing up prepared and not expecting others to teach me everything. Also advocating for systematic change, whether that's even just in a one-off like conversation, like, oh yeah, more people should be doing this. Who else could do this at your work? And pushing for those equitable workloads. And in our Indigenous Indigenous Strategies Working Group, we built in a rule that the chair must take a year off after serving a term to distribute the responsibility and prevent the work from resting on the shoulders of our Indigenous colleagues. And finally, and this one's my most important point, I think, is the practicing humility and knowing that mistakes will be made. I often reflect on when I need to step forward and when I need to step back. And sometimes support means leading a project, and other times it means creating spaces for Indigenous voices to lead. And learning that balance is really ongoing work. And so all of this stuff is really ongoing work and balancing. And I bet you if you asked Rachel, Kaya, and I to do this webinar this time next year, we would have completely different things to talk about and completely different projects. And we'd be talking about we could be talking about way different things. So these are ongoing conversations to have. And so we really want to say thank you for listening and for coming. We will start answering some of the Q&A questions and for the last 10 or so minutes. So thank you so much for listening to us today.
All right. Thank you all so much for that presentation. Like Bronte just said, we'll now turn to the Q&A to ask some of your questions that you've been dropping throughout the presentation. So to start, I see one at the top from Nathaniel Porter who asks if there are parallels to FINMEO and CRKN that apply to Indigenous groups in the United States. And I'm assuming that's directed to Kaya. I
That's
think it
probably
popped up
directed to
during
me,
her
yeah.
section. Yeah.
So I was thinking about this for a while because, of course, being in Canada, I'm consistently thinking about the Canadian ones, but I do remember that the PCC preliminary report from the task group of metadata related to Indigenous peoples of the Americas. I was a part of that. We went through and took a look at a bunch of different vocabularies. So I'm not sure if there is one that is like an exact parallel, but I have my little Google document open so I can like scroll through and say, we took a look at things like the Indigenous people subject heading crosswalk from the Peabody Essex Museum, Homosaurus, the Library of Congress demographic group terms list, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the U.S. Indian Boarding School Records Access Point Controlled Vocabulary Dictionary. And then, of course, there was a bunch of ones that like we were aware existed, but like could not access via the internet. You know, this sometimes happens. Like the Alaska Library Archive has a grant project that they've been working on since 2023. And there's the Hispanic American Periodicals Index, then Massachusetts PAWIC Thesaurus for American Indian Terminology. There's the Nicola one, but that's more Canadian, is my understanding. That's more Canadian. The Laualau so Hawaiian and National Indian Law Library. So I'm not sure if there is one that is an exact parallel to the FINMEO in Canada for the States. If there is, I would like to know.
Okay. Well, next question comes from Heather Coates, who asks, I work at an urban campus with a substantial group of people who do community engaged research, mostly in urban settings. In supporting their research, I hear many similarities between the approaches and best practices in those conversations. Co-creation of goals and research questions prioritize building relationships with community partners and outcomes that benefit everyone. I wonder if these approaches resonate with best practices in Indigenous research. Are there key differences that we should be aware of? And that's open to, all the presenters if you'd like to answer.
I could start. So yes, I think that all of that is a great place to start regarding research with Indigenous peoples in an urban setting. I actually maybe should preface this with so at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, I'm based in the Surrey campus, which is, in addition to having overlapping traditional territories with many First Nations, we're also home to one of the largest urban Indigenous populations. So we've got a bit of a mixing of local Indigenous, both local First Nations and then urban Indigenous folks that are not living on their homelands. And so I think when engaging in research with Indigenous peoples in an urban setting, you can connect both with the First Nations leadership and elders within your area if there are communities based within your urban setting. But you can also connect with places like friendship centers and other urban Indigenous supports and connect with leadership there to begin a conversation. But in both circumstances, there should be elders and people, elder or knowledge keeper type people, where you can connect with them for research guidance as well. I'm not sure if that answers the question, Heather. Was there a thumbs up? Did I miss it? Does anyone else have anything they want to contribute, Kaya or Bronte?
I think maybe that was a thumbs up.
Yeah, that sounded good.
All right. No, let's see the next question. We have one from Deborah Oropeza who says, are you familiar with the work of academic librarians in Latin America regarding Indigenous studies? And if so, how does it compare to the work of librarians in Canada and the US? If anyone wants to jump on that one.
I don't have much to say to that. Just that I'm aware there's some work going on, but I haven't done that close of a comparison or an investigation into it. It's my understanding that different colonial governments identify Indigenous peoples differently, which can make things complicated in terms of finding, locating, and verifying Indigenous peoples within different geographic contexts. So I've predominantly sort of looked at the Canadian context for my own work. There's also a bit of, for me, a barrier regarding language, as English is my first and only language, thanks to our colonial government system. And so engaging with materials that are often in other languages, particularly Spanish, are not really accessible to me. So I haven't really investigated that closely myself, but perhaps my colleagues Bronte or Kaya have.
Equally, I have not. I'm very interested though. Does the person who asked the question have like any readings or anything they want to like share with us? I find December is a good time to learn a bunch of new things.
Yeah, if so, please feel free to share them in the chat or in the Q&A with the rest of us. I don't know if Bronte wanted to add anything.
Sorry, I
But
was,
it,
I
yeah,
was
no, it's
answering
okay.
I was answering like a different question in the chat
No, no
or in the
problem.
Q&A, but I also have not really looked at beyond the US or Canada. But I do know that there's another area that comes up a lot for us, and Rachel and Kaya, you both probably also would say this is New Zealand and Australia. I feel like we see a lot more come from New Zealand and Australia, and knowing and that because usually New Zealand and Australia honestly is ahead of Canada in quite a lot of ways with their with their Indigenous knowledge keeping. I learn a lot from them in my own work as just a way, like it's not necessarily Latin America, but if you're looking for non-North American perspectives, who have also have people who have been colonized by those same European powers, I would look over there.
Yeah, great point. And like I said, if anyone does have any resources, feel free to add them in the Q&A to share with others. So I'll move on to this one's not a question, just a comment from Jared Hooten, who says, I wanted to express how incredible this presentation is and thank everyone involved. So, thanks again to all of our panelists. And let's see, we have another one from Michael Johnson that says, can the panelists make a suggestion for a starting point relative to choosing a database to store our tribe's research materials, which is about 50% paper and 50% in electronic form? And before anyone answers, I just wanted to mention that Jennifer Abel also dropped a suggestion in the Q&A for anyone who's interested, but please, I'll open that up to our panelists to answer if they have any suggestions.
I'm just taking a look at what Jennifer Abel dropped in the chat.
Fair, good point. Sorry, I should have mentioned it out loud. Yeah, well, there's also a link too if anyone wants to look that up.
Just note, I don't really select databases, but perhaps Kaya, that might be more your. I
I
don't want to
equally
put you on
don't
the
select
spot.
databases.
I also
Okay.
don't collect databases. I try to stay out of, when we have database collection questions that are related to Indigenous studies, my first email is Kaya. So
But I will say,
Got it.
knowing
Yeah.
very little about this app, I do appreciate that they have a who we work with at like the bottom of if you scroll down, where it's like Canadian Museums for Human Rights, Provincial Health Services Authority, PHSA Indigenous Health. Like I like it when we can go, who are we working with? What's going on? Can we ask them for basically a reference?
Right, right. All right. Well, then that might be, our best answer for right now. So, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that. And I'll move on to another question. Um, this one says from Amy, I caught some of the references throughout this webinar, but not all. I'm particularly interested in the two that Bronte shared, AI and Cyber Policies by Cherokee Nation and a blank. I'm guessing they missed that portion. If someone could share those again, thanks. And I think
We
I should
do have a
just,
reference slide.
yes, I was going to say, I think that will be shared with the slides. Yeah, after the presentation. But Bronte is maybe also just sharing that in the chat as well, or in the
I did.
Q&A. Thank you.
Sorry.
Um, And then let's see what else. A lot of thank yous. Thank you, so helpful. And then we have another one that from Talisian, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. It says, do you happen to know the name of the resource from the Alaska Libraries? I'm currently trying to fix metadata in a collection and would love to use that resource.
Yeah, give me a second. I'm scrolling in my Google document. That this is why
Perfect.
you always have to have a million things open when
Yeah,
doing a
yeah.
presentation.
Of course, of course. Okay, so while you look for that one, Kaya, I'll just jump on to the next question. See if maybe Rachel and Bronte want to answer. This one is from Ian Gordon, who says, I'm involved with scholars on identifying Canadian Indigenous plants and find it hard to identify sources. This research takes trust, time, patience, and collaboration, which is difficult for many non-Indigenous peoples. How might we preface our work to respect Indigenous voices, oral traditions, and lived experiences? So that's open to whoever wants to answer first.
That's a big question. I'm maybe making some assumptions here. So you were wondering maybe how to acknowledge Indigenous oral sources as part of the plant identification. If that's the case, then I guess, yeah, looking at ways to cite oral sources, there's quite a few different options out there. And like Kaya's sister, Larissa, actually developed like an oral, like a knowledge keeper kind of way of citating. So for APA, MLA, and Chicago, I think they're actually now integrated into the formal citation guides. So you might want to check those out and see if that might be a way of acknowledging oral traditions and oral sources for your research.
Yeah. And yeah, I just noticed the time as well. So I think that's probably a good stopping point to wrap things up. Thanks so much to Kaya, Rachel, and Bronte for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement and your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording, as well as the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us today. We hope you found the session informative and engaging, and we hope to see you again soon on another webinar. So thank you again, everyone.